Good afternoon and welcome to our summer extraordinaire webcast on Ask the Executive Directors, NASCIO, and PTI. We've been doing this for a few summers. It's kind of our mid-cap after our January national webcast that we've done every year for over 10 years now, looking at what's ahead on the state and local IT front. So I'm going to turn it over to Alan Shark for PTI for some introductory comments, and then we'll get right into our program today, which is essentially owned by you all. So put your comments and questions in the chat, and we're going to basically be very light on opening comments and slides. So Alan, back to you.
Great. Well, thanks, Doug, and thanks for the opportunity. You know, this is kind of our newer version of what we did in January, and this is probably our third annual event of its kind. We always run out of time in January. We're so busy talking about the future, and now we're 6 months into the future that we predicted. I wonder how well we're doing. I think we've done pretty well. So this is more focused on your questions. We do have a few opening remarks. I have a few announcements to make that I think are very important and exciting, at least for us. So we're just honored, and we actually look forward to seeing everybody in October in St. Paul, Minnesota. Back to you, Doug.
Thank you, Ansel. I'm going to start on the state side, and let me prepare some kind of introductory slides here. If you all can see that, I'm sharing my slides now, and we're going to talk about just a recap of the 2023 top 10 priorities. And this is, again, just for a level set so that you all understand some of the topics that we're going to address today at a more general level. And again, just a reminder that questions should go in the chat. And we have some questions that were submitted by our audience in advance during registration, and we'll address those as well. But again, this is the top 10 for 2023 for state CIOs. We do this every year, late in the calendar year, and ask state CIOs to prognosticate their top 10 strategies and management processes and solutions. And we'll be doing this again in for 2024. But not surprisingly, cybersecurity and risk management has been number one on the hit parade for 10 consecutive years. And we continue to address that in a variety of ways with the association representing the state CIOs of the now 53 states and territories on District of Columbia. District digital services has come up very dramatically over the past couple of years, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And also workforce, so the whole state IT workforce, the whole, as we called our study last year, the people imperative. Significant challenges, particularly in a post-pandemic world, and we're seeing some really interesting data this year around how many CIOs, particularly, which is our prime audience, are looking to bring more state IT employees on board because of resignations and a lot of churn that took place during the pandemic and the post-pandemic. So not surprising, we're going to see a lot of discussions around state IT workforce. And legacy modernization, always on the list, along with cloud and consolidation and CRM, and those have stayed pretty steady. Identity and access management is relatively new, and we're seeing a lot of interest in that. I can certainly talk about that. I think the other thing that's conspicuous by its absence, we saw this a few months ago, is no discussion on here on budget and cost control or financial constraints. That may come up because that's cyclical, but at least the last couple of years, that has not been on the CIO top 10 list where it had been for 14 previous years. So we're looking at that as at least a minor trend and blip. States continue to spend through their financial grants and things coming in from the federal government. So very quickly, we're going to cover these certainly in some of our questions, but I wanted to give you kind of an overview of the kind of state IT landscape in broad brush strokes about what's going on. Again, continued focus on digital services, improving overall. I would describe it as just improving the citizen experience with government, with more citizen-centric design, human. You look at design thinking, again, using various tools and processes that states are now adopting to streamline and automate. So we're going to see a lot of focus on that. Not surprisingly, elevated cyber threats. We've seen an increase just recently with ransomware within the states, with the MOVE It incident and event. That was very unusual. States have been relatively immune from significant cyber ransomware events in the last decade, but we've seen that really tick up with the Move It incident. Human error and just around phishing and malware, that continues to be a major factor. And states are focusing on more whole of state resilience by working with other organizations, particularly local government, higher education, utilities, and things like that. We'll talk about state IT workforce. Have my 7 R's in there. These are all in play, particularly around reskilling and the growth in the use of remote work. Adoption of cloud, provided some quick data here in a minute, but we're seeing obviously broader adoption, more strategic initiatives around cloud adoption. I would describe this as moving more toward that hybrid cloud environment with a variety of multiple cloud providers and moving to more off-premise cloud services. Process automation, robotic process automation, machine learning, AI, chatbots enabled AI, low code, no code. These are some of the emerging technologies. And we certainly couldn't talk today without a discussion around the greatest hype factor around generative AI that's taking place. And so a lot of questions about that. In fact, we got multiple questions about generative AI in our previously submitted set of questions in registration. So we can certainly address that. And then from my perspective, one of the major impacts, 2022, 32 gubernatorial elections. Many of those were incumbents, and therefore we only ended up with 9 new governors and only one major party flip in the state. That would have certainly denoted more CIO churn in that space. That has not happened, but what's really unusual is as of yesterday, we have 21 CIO transitions in 2023 to date, way above what I would have ever expected or forecast. I usually pretty close to looking at that, but we've seen a lot of changes in the state. So that's very, very new. And that has an impact, obviously, on leadership, the continuity of leadership, and the advancement of strategic initiatives. And then finally, just some quick data around the cloud and what's going on cloud services. This is the initial findings, not yet published, from our second cloud study with Accenture, where we looked at kind of broad variety of topics around cloud adoption, from strategy to financial models and what the motivation is. And you can see some of this data in terms of what's going on too. I think important points is that one, that we're seeing accelerated cloud adoption. Security remains both a positive and negative aspect of the considerations. Previously, certainly security was an impediment to a lot of considerations around off-premise cloud services, but now that has become a benefit in many cases. And as you can see, not surprisingly, as I mentioned, workforce, 88% of the state CIOs responded that training and skills gaps continue to prevent them from broadening their adoption. So they are held back by the fact that they need more training and reskilling around cloud adoption, cloud management, certainly with the expansion within the business areas. They're trying to figure out the governance side of that. And then finally, before I turn it over to Alan and we get to some questions here, these are some of the things that are on the horizon. In some cases, by that I mean within perhaps weeks. Cybersecurity grant was $1 billion 4-year program under CISA that NASCIO has been actively involved in. The states are the recipient of those dollars, which go 80% of those dollars must be utilized or directed to local governments. And some of that's being done through shared services, but they're collaborating with their local governments. We have the majority, I'd say 75%, the majority of the states have a shared services model, meaning that they're going to be delivering services to local governments in lieu of giving indirect grants, but some are doing a mix of that. So that's really important to follow. 400 million on the table for year 2, and CISA anticipates releasing the notice of funding opportunity very shortly for year 2. So again, 400 million in year 2. I talked about the workforce. One of the things that we're seeing right now in terms of attracting, particularly in the cyberspace, is a significant emphasis on hybrid and remote work, which wasn't the case just 3 years ago. That wasn't even on the board. And now we see that is top of the list in terms of how to recruit and retain the talent that you need. So that's important to note, that states are going to have to be flexible. They're going to have a new model, and part of that is promoting remote work aspects and also reskilling. And we've seen now a number of states, if you're seeing the headlines, that have removed four-year degree requirements. And so that is something that the many CIOs are looking at, as they can leverage that. A lot of discussion about post-pandemic fraud, increasing program integrity, fraud analytics, reducing the amount of financial fraud. Estimates are over $120 billion nationwide at the state level, 120 billion of both federal and state funds that have been victims of fraud because of the pandemic relief efforts. We'll mention certainly artificial intelligence, and particularly generative AI. That is number one on the emerging IT opportunities for state CIOs. As just in our latest data that we haven't released yet, those were the top two items, and we're going to see more questions around the tremendous promise, the tremendous hype, a need for governance. Over 80 bills in under legislative consideration in the states around AI or aspects of AI, including multiple states that the bills have already passed, where they're creating an AI task force, an AI study commission. So we're going to see more conversation from the legislative side, and more conversation around guardrails and, again, effective use of particularly generative AI. Privacy, growth of state privacy officers. Almost half the states now have a chief privacy officer at the enterprise level. The majority of them report to the state CIO. We host the state chief privacy officer committee of practice, and so we are in regular conversations with those folks, and that's going to be something growing, absent meaningful federal privacy legislation, which we haven't seen yet. Many states are passing their own privacy legislation. And then finally, just as one tidbit that's interesting, is we've talked a lot about foreign product bans and what's going on with our friends at TikTok and Huawei and others. And we're seeing certainly a growth of that in the last year, accelerated dramatically now with 40 states that have banned at some level, either through a directive, through an executive order, or through legislation, software, application platforms, social media, networking. They have banned those. So you got to look at what's coming next on that list. So that's my quick run through about where we are today and what's on the horizon. And I'm going to turn it back over to Alan now and let him cover the local government sector. Alan.
Thank you, Doug. As I think everyone will see, the issues here are very complementary. We might transpose one issue over another, but the top 10 aligns very well to what we're seeing in our research. Although our respective research is out of sync. Ours comes out in April, yours comes out in October, but nevertheless, we always are monitoring the latest issues. So I mentioned an announcement, and some of you may have already heard this, but PTI was established in 1973, and we've had an interesting journey. And I think our logos over time have reflected that. But about 5 years ago, 4.5 years ago, we aligned with CompTIA, and you could see the progression of how we were assimilated into the group. They grew by $10 million a year. And while we were still growing, we just couldn't keep up with that kind of growth. And there was a decision that was made at the end of last year that they really were rethinking their entire public sector, and we had to find a new home. So as our logo got smaller and smaller, we're happy to announce we do have a new home. We're very much PTI, but now we're part of Fusion Learning Partners, headquartered in St. Paul, Minnesota. So we feel very good about this. It gives us, I think, access to more staff, more resources in the areas where we could use the most help. We are part of a three-legged stool and are very much involved with the other things that are going on with them. They have one of the largest, well, they have the largest symposium in IT for state and local government in the entire Midwest, and that's coming up in December at the St. Paul River Center. So we're excited to be helping out with that, as well as their other activities. CompTIA Shark Bites has now just become sharkbites.net. If you have a story you'd like to share, we're always looking for stories to tell. We've done a few recently on artificial intelligence, and the one that is current at the moment is about heat, where we brought back an episode from June of 2022 where we interviewed the nation's first chief heat officer, who is in Phoenix, Arizona. And the issues are still the same, if not more dire. So much of the data that we talk about, just like with Doug and Nacio, is our 2023 PTI State of City County IT National Survey. Just write to us, let us know, and we'll make sure you get a copy. So here's my Shark top issues in lieu of, we're between our surveys. Our cyber survey comes out in October. The other just came out in April. Number one, and these are not necessarily in order, but AI policy and applications. This is huge. We are seeing applications already occurring using AI or people calling it AI. We've got to be careful. But policy is interesting. As Doug kind of alluded to, many states are doing things. Well, so are cities. Yes, Connecticut might have been the first to grab headlines by saying they created a commission to create a Bill of AI rights for citizens. But New York City has been very much in the game with their AI reports and policies having to do with hiring and making sure that there's no bias in using AI in any hiring decisions. I'm most interested in the city of Tempe, Arizona. And you'll be hearing more about that from us, and including podcast that's coming up. And that is, they do have an interesting policy that has already been approved by the city council. What's unique is it's a very thorough policy that's far-reaching, but the words that got my attention was that we must learn to partner with AI. That kind of freaked me out. I stepped back and said, we must learn to partner. And it's kind of like, this is the first time we're referring to AI as like an entity as opposed to a tool. So we shall see how that plays out. Number two, cyber, but there's two parts to it, funding. We've been, I would say, disappointed, and we should also be grateful, but disappointed that we have not seen the dollars that were kind of flashed in our face. You know, $1 billion sounds like a lot of money to be allocated over X years, 80% going to local governments. There first was a year delay in getting the rules written. And then when the rules were written, they were pretty complicated, a lot of hoops to go through, and all these different apparatus that was set up by the states. 2 states decided not even to get in that first tranche because it was too complicated, not enough time. And I'm afraid that, as Doug alluded to, that the final outcome will not be money going to local governments where they need it the most in cyber, but more for services in their name that they will have access to. Now, that's better than nothing, and I'm sure that will help, but that's not the way we were planning things. So we're still very concerned about funding. We still have time. We'll watch the rules very, very carefully and watch what's going on in the states. But there's a lot of new players in that, in terms of FEMA and others that are part of this allocation process that we normally, as CIOs, don't interact with. We're concerned about supply chain attacks, and this really has created, I think, a sense of we got to really rethink zero trust, because normally we had our own issues, but when we turned to our service providers and MSPs, we thought that they would be the ones that could be another layer to help guard us. And we have learned in 3 cases over the last 3 years that isn't the case, that we've got to even be more vigilant, that you can never delegate responsibility. So that comes back to haunt us. We're very concerned about that. Staffing, that's just a general category to say that we're having problems retaining people, attracting people, and part of it is many local governments are going back to, you've got to be in the office. We don't want remote work anymore. A very Byzantine approach that flies against all the productivity that was proven during COVID. We have issues of not having enough money for travel and training. And the response is, well, get that on the internet. And here we have our CIOs managing multi-million-dollar portfolios. What other profession doesn't require or encourage further training and retraining? This is absolutely critical. Number 4 is surprise. This is not in any of our surveys, but this is something that we're hearing, especially in the summer, and that is climate and climate change. When you think about all these factors, every one of these has a technology piece to it, from measuring air quality and reporting it, water availability and water quality, measuring it and reporting it, in some cases, rerouting it, health, e-health in particular, when people can't go outside because it's code purple. Food insecurity gets worse. People that used to grow crops in the yards or in certain shared areas, it's dried up. energy, the usage. I mean, our generating capacities are at peak loads, not just during the day, but now at night. Transportation suffers by this. Shelter, we need to have more shelter, cooling centers, and this leads to financial instability that could affect the bottom line of both state and local government, let alone the national. It's something that I think as IT leaders, we've got to look at collectively and say, this actually is something that impacts us and things that we should be looking at on behalf of our citizens. I also worry about election integrity and security, but we'll go back to IT modernization. That still is usually in the top 3 to top 4 things that are up there. I think that's going to be less of an issue as more of local governments turn to managed service providers, which I think is a growing trend. In many ways, a reasonable and positive trend. For the MSPs out there, you've heard me say it for the last 2 years, we see more local governments turning to you. They may call it shared services, they may call it vendor services. There's many different names, but they're turning to third parties to provide the staff expertise and the applications that they're not able to do the way they would like on premise. By paying as you go and moving to a more CapEx environment, which is a continuing journey, each year, there's more of a take rate on that by necessity. It makes it harder for politicians and senior managers to say, well, it's working another year. It's always been another year, another year. When you have contracts that you're paying quarterly or annually, you can't say that. And it's not so easy to get out of some of these contracts, which probably is good. But I did mention election integrity and security. This is something that I think we have to pay attention to. More of our counties are getting more concerned, and this is where MSISAC and the election ISAC comes very, very important. And then 2 general things. We're seeing a continuation of the rejection of expertise and the rise of ignorance. And this is a burden for many of us who worry about social media and misinformation and disinformation. This problem isn't going away. There are technological solutions, but we've got to be ever vigilant at a time when deep fake is getting deeper and more fake. And then the politicization of everything. For the first time in discussions with local governments, this is causing a lot of issues having to do with morale. That they keep fighting, they're not governing. And this affects the workplace. It does impact morale, and it does impact this whole idea of providing enough resources to local government. Almost half, I think 52% said that their funding for IT is up this year. So in terms of general funding, that's a positive thing. A small percentage said they saw anywhere from a 3 to 5% decrease, but they're truly in a minority. So it's all over the board. When you're dealing with local government, you're dealing the very smallest and the very largest. The very smallest, the CIO might be the city or county manager or an assistant manager. On the larger side, they could have a staff of 500. So it's kind of hard to kind of come up with that middle area, but these are the issues that we see. And I'll make the slide deck available if anybody would like it. I'll make sure that Nacio has it. So with that, I think it's time for discussion.
Yes, yes, sir. So we had some pre-submitted questions, but now that you've heard our materials this afternoon, today, that you might be interested in following up, please put questions in the chat and we will get to those. But let's go ahead and take a look at a couple of questions here. We've got, not surprisingly, Alan, a lot of questions around AI and generative AI. So we might want to, I can get that off the board to begin with, and I'll talk a little bit about the state. If people are interested in AI use cases and what the states are doing or what they possibly might do with AI. We actually conducted a national survey and a study in 2020 about artificial intelligence within the states. And we use that term very, very, very broadly to look at that, talking about, again, as Alan said, true AI is somewhat, at that point anyway, was relatively rare in the states. But we saw some early kind of use cases and early adoption of that. A lot of that driven by the pandemic, quite frankly. So AI-enabled intelligent agents, supported intelligent agents, chatbots for help desks and call centers, enhancing decision support around health trends. I think AI ops for the CIO organizations, again, the merging of AI and their operational intelligence platforms is important. It's going to become even more important. Cybersecurity threat assessments have always been in that space, but that is definitely growing with the tools that are available. So I see cybersecurity and continue to be a target. So these are some of the things already there. Transportation, traffic flow analysis, transportation is a major player, I think, in that space. So those are some of the things that were over 3 years ago were being discussed as current use cases and just surely expanding. And part of that was driven certainly by the pandemic in terms of what we saw with intelligence support. Today, I think more interest around fraud detection, particularly as I mentioned in all of these entitlement and public assistance programs, analysis around risk. Alan mentioned climate, certainly natural disaster forecast, risk analysis, streamlining, just general processes and workflows and automation. So as I mentioned, this is an area where a lot of states have really pushed forward in terms of just, RPA capabilities, not sophisticated AI, but just using some of the tools in that stack with the machine learning. Generative AI has unleashed a whole new set of unmanaged expectations about what's going to happen. And we can certainly, I'll kick it over to Alan, but we've got states that are using those capabilities to a degree and testing those. We've got some states that are using AI to create analysis, for example, sifting through a significant number of public comments from citizens and to be able to draw inferences and patterns from that without having to spend human eyeball time going through those. So that's going to happen, I think, more and more with state governments anyway, but lots of promise, lots of potential, certainly lots of discussions around governance, around guardrails, around structuring that. Some of those, which is, I think, could be certainly considered concern and dangerous, as some of those may come from the legislative bodies as they look at this. And so I think CIOs are cautious about, how much of their work in this area is going to be impinged by directed legislative mandates, because they are very concerned about that side of the equation. They would prefer to do it, and at least with one members in the executive branch, and come up with these task forces and come up with these discussions early on. One state, Maine, has already announced a moratorium on so very, very early out of the gate, moratorium for 6 months on any generative AI use within the executive branch. They were concerned about the potential of, again, exposing risk and some of the unintended consequences. So I think we're going to see, that's unusual, only one, but I think we're going to see more conversation about guidance and maybe perhaps stopping bad things from happening first. So we'll see that as these task forces get stood up. Alan, I know we've written a lot, and we've certainly done that collaboratively with the National Academy as well as AI, but thoughts about local governments on that topic.
Yeah, well, very similar kind of concerns. I mean, on the use side, anything with data, AI becomes the perfect complement in terms of looking for anomalies, patterns, and things that humans can't see as quickly or as readily. So we're going to see that in health to better pinpoint things. We're going to see it already in police being able to predict things before they occur, hopefully, and to be able to come up with different kinds of plans based on data. Of course, much rests with the quality of data. The other side is the human interface with our citizens. We're already seeing that through the pandemic, the use of chatbots. And that's kind of a misleading term because chatbots sometimes describe something on text, but sometimes voice. And speech recognition with these robots and computers has been remarkable. I've talked to some, and I was talking to one in an airline, and I said, "You're not real, are you?" And he said, "Does it matter?" And I guess I said not. And this robot was very efficient. And then I said, "Is your supervisor a robot?" And this is what is interesting. The response was, "You wouldn't know either." So I thought to myself, how interesting. And for the first time, I'm saying, wow, they're going to be putting humor in AI, because this is right now humorless, except when it makes ridiculous and embarrassing mistakes. So, but on the policy side, this is interesting where, yeah, everyone's kind of figuring out, how do we be proactive? How do we do things now before things might get worse and it's too late to turn back? Both corporate America and I would say government generally is very nervous about the use of ChatGPT in the office. And the big reason is, and there are many unintended outcomes, but we can guess what some of them are. And that is, anytime you're putting information into a system, we have no guarantee that it will not be shared or used by somebody, including intellectual property, copyright, sensitive and information that should not be shared. And yet those things could really be helpful. And this is where there's a dilemma. The public administrator is saying, but I need to have these tools to help me. And I get that. But as long as we have open AI systems the way we have them now, it's going to make it really difficult. Managers say, we can't guarantee what comes out of that black box. We're not even sure what's in it. So this is kind of a strange time to have a technology like this that is so powerful and positive, at the same time so potentially dangerous in terms of the norms that we're used to and the laws that we adhere to. So two things for fun. One, a podcast going back 4 episodes, I actually interview Alexa and ChatGPT. If you want to hear that, it's kind of interesting. And number 2, I had an article published yesterday, American City County Magazine, on local governments regulating policy in AI. Why not ask ChatGPT? And that's exactly what I did. So the outcome is very interesting in terms of they laid out a perfect outline. It's an interesting discussion. And I think this is something that's going to go on for a long time, but there is an itch among legislator and local governments to do something because they just fear something is not totally right. This is so new and so unpredictable. And the very fact that they've had to invent a word called hallucination. When I first heard that, I thought somebody was kidding. But when these systems come up with something that is totally wrong, and I've had experience with that, and you would hear that in the podcast that I did, that is now referred to as hallucination. And no one can explain exactly where they come from other than they're coming up with words and phrases because they want to give you something as opposed to saying, I don't know. I wish they would say, I don't know, than saying that I'm the CIO of the city of Atlanta, which in one rendition it said, which is absolutely not true.
Very good, very good. We've got several questions that were submitted again in advance, and I've kind of combined all those because there's questions around these kind of AI use cases, not just generative AI, just AI in general. I will not speak to generative AI as much as I will just potential for AI. So I thought, even though we always talk about these webcasts, I always say facts are optional. I'm going to give you some facts. So these will be good kind of a sneak preview of some of the data we're going to be releasing in October, where we asked our state CIOs in our most recent survey to basically select and rank their potential benefit from AI business processes. So what did they think over the next 3 years or so? What areas within their state were going to benefit the most? By far and away, it was citizen services. Digital citizen services was number one by a fairly wide margin. But cybersecurity, that I already mentioned, and cybersecurity operations, threat assessments, that is strong number 2. Fraud prevention and detection came in. Again, in the number 3 slot, procurement and acquisition, including contracting. And from a generative AI perspective, we've seen this. So we're going to have AI on the analysis side, but we've had states that have already been testing writing an RFP using ChatGPT. So they're basically using that platform to write the draft RFP. And many of them report that it was a pretty strong result of using that. And then finally, last 2, HR. Including recruitment, and we've seen a lot of discussions around the use of these tools within the HR screening capabilities on the processing side, and then licensing and permitting. So that's the kind of lineup that we're seeing again from one community, the state CIOs. They're looking at it from the enterprise perspective. So Alan talked about of what we're seeing in there. Alan got a question here in the chat. I'm going to go back to I think it's related to your top 10 there. What role does trust play in number 8 and number 9, which I think had to do with challenges around, the trust in government and the rejection of experts' thought. What are the recommendations to further increase trust in government? Comments on that?
Yeah, that's probably the toughest thing that I see, because it's not a technical issue, and CIOs in particular are used to solving policies and technical issues. This is far broader in society, but I needed to point it out because we have one of our students who is in the K to 12 realm talking about his concern about the potential for somebody to put something in social media or chat that might say that he's ready to kill somebody, and somebody misses it, and then suddenly the school district is liable. So when you start thinking about liability and all this, you realize that there is a technology piece for greater monitoring and understanding, and I think this is where AI can come in. But the bottom line, and if you look at the what even ChatGPT in my little interview and question suggests, is we just need to have more of a dialogue with some of these naysayers. I mean, there's no way we can force anybody to have better appreciation of what technology can do, but there seems to be a growing distrust of government, of course, and that's been on a downward slide for decades. More so on the federal side, less so for state, and even less so for local governments, because I guess we're closer. But I think we have to have a dialogue, and we can no longer just assume that the experts, because one is an expert, that they just, are the ones that will be making all these rules. I think there's a burden upon public officials and staff like ourselves to bring people in the tent wherever we can and let them see things as we do. I think the first movement towards that occurred about 10 years ago with the open data movement. Now, when you look at the open data movement, you might think, oh, that was the brilliance of the public requiring data. No, it did not happen from the public. The public didn't even know they could ask for it. Where that really came from was public management, who were under assault in a time when having data close to the heart was power. Now, some people, an enlightened group of people said, there's more power in sharing information and letting people see what we're seeing with our eyes. I think we need more of that perspective to encourage people to take a look at things, because I don't want to give up on expertise. There are experts, we pay experts, we need experts, and there's a reason why we have them. That's why we have to understand the relationship between elected leaders and this so-called bad guy, this deep state that technically we're all part of. I don't buy that. I think there is a definite need for experts to help work with the politicians. They should not abandon us. And it's going to require a lot more dialogue. And when you are on the winning side of an argument, your staff experts are fine. When you're on the losing side, then the staff experts on the opposing side. So we've got to rise above some of this battle to the bottom of intellectual morality. And but it begins with good discussions, and we're at a point in time where we have more data to share that can make our point. And this is where I love GIS, to be able to show, map things, and let people play with some of this stuff and give them a better sense of what they can do. In elections, yeah, they should be able to see what's going on in ways that we never thought we needed to do, as long as they're arm's length, that they can see what they need to see and be reassured, because right now they're being fueled by a lot of misleading and absolute misinformation and disinformation, and we've got to take that on head on.
Yeah, I agree, Alan. That's a challenge, and I think that was certainly a outcome or response from the challenges that state governments had during the pandemic. I think the trust equation for many citizens was broken because of the inability of the states to deliver those services in a critical time in a streamlined and efficient manner. And that's because obviously they were overburdened, but you had literally millions of citizens that had not actually transacted any digital services with state government at all. And now they were forced to do so, and they found that whole experience. And so they lost trust in the institution. And obviously lots of commentary about that. That if you look at the priorities of CIOs over the next 2 to 3 years in our study, we asked them to really look at that in a post-pandemic kind of world. And number one was enhancing citizen services, enhancing that experience, which again was exposed during the pandemic as being unfriendly, not streamlined, a very poor experience. And the same thing with the back end legacy aging systems, as well as those systems that may not have been that old, but certainly were not designed to handle the magnitude of the crush of those citizens coming to those agency portals. And so I think that again caused even additional erosion of I can't really trust my state government to be, we talk about that state government should be, at its best when citizens' lives are at their worst. And that did not happen. So a lot of recovery that has to take place there. In terms of the both the governance model and the operational side, and many of the states have really stepped up their game. We're seeing that. We're seeing a dramatic set of expansions around those citizen services, and some really good examples of states leading the way, improving their citizen experience with a wide variety of solutions. So that's got to continue to mature. Alan, let's jump back and talk about a question here about discussion. This is changing gears about the role of the CIO, broker strategist, and leader, as opposed to a technician, and whether all of the current discussions about emerging tech and AI and generative AI is going to cause any changes to that. I'll give you my quick answer from the state CIO perspective. No, we haven't seen that. With a lot of more discussion, but they are bringing in the experts. They're creating these task forces. There's a bill in Connecticut that would actually create a chief AI officer within the Department of Administration. So they're looking at another chief, bring another chief to the table. So I don't think that's going to change the role of the CIO. They are clearly marching forward with more. We look at how they're going to deliver services. It's more outsourcing, more managed services, more cloud, more software as a service. Things that have shifted even in the last decade. A tremendous shift from what I would call kind of the sacred cows. Well, we may do some of these things at a small level, but we're certainly not going to put our ERP, our financials in the cloud off premise. We're certainly not going to put HR and personnel and payroll in an off premise cloud solution provider. Well, that's all gone by the wayside. So things that, we're told as solid facts that we're not going to change have all morphed into a much more fluid environment. And there's a variety of reasons for that. As you said, the CapEx, OpEx discussion, it continues to drive that, but they want more flexibility. So I see the CIO at the state level anyway, continue to be the business leader of IT in terms of the capabilities. When we ask what are the top characteristics or the dimensions of leadership that really point to successful state CIOs, it's being a strategist, it's being a communicator, and it's being relationship management, business relationship management. Technologist is down number 9 or 10 on the list. So that's my quick answer.
Yeah, and I would say I start with the same answer, no. Although it's more of a challenge, I think, at the local level, because I think there's a greater struggle because of staffing and the perception of what the CIO does. I mean, I've been fascinated by the NASCIO study. In 2018, of a list of 10, technologists was listed number 9. And in 2022, guess what? It was still 9. The first 3 transposed, but it was still 9. I use that a lot. And local government CIOs, scratch their head, because not only now they expected to know the other 7 areas or 8 areas, they still want to be the technical person. So part of it is that they still came up the ranks, they understand technology, and there's nobody else there to fill that vacuum yet. I think the bench at local government is rather thin. I think they would desire to have that kind of model where they could have the luxury. We did a study like 15 years ago that said that they could spend 5% planning and strategizing in a given week, they would be happy. That's pretty amazing. And what they were saying is they were so busy putting out fires, literally, and worrying about lost passwords, help desk overflow, all these different issues. When the city manager, who do they call? I mean, this is like Ghostbusters. They're constantly getting those calls, middle of the night. They're always on call. It is very, very stressful. I think there's more layers at the state government, just given distance and the like. But the paradox for the local government, they're expected to take on these new soft skills or professional skills that they really weren't expected to have before. That's why in our training programs, we've really focused on emotional intelligence and all the other soft skills and communication. because the language has changed. Yeah, it's no longer cool wearing jeans and cutoffs to make sure everyone knew you were the tech person. Now it's like we always say, dress like the climate, whatever's, going on. Look at the execs and don't try to be different. You want to be more in line so they can feel comfortable. It's not how you feel comfortable. It's all these soft skills. So yeah, it's going to change. I think it's going to be far more managerial. It's going to be more far-reaching, less technical over time.
Yeah, and if you look at, again, I think the major gaps, two things. One is on the capabilities and discipline side, throughout all of our work over the last couple of years, a common theme is we don't have people that have transitioned from the technical side into contractor monitoring, brokering, working with our external partners and vendors on solutions. We need people that can fit in that space because we've now, outsourced part of that technical capacity, particularly on the cloud and SaaS side. And so we need people that can actually manage a program and manage a set of delivery vehicles and a set of contractors. Those are the people that we really see there's an issue with. And I think another part of that for the leadership, whether it's a CIO or others, when I talk to governors, state officials, legislators, we do policy things with legislators. I often talk about their state CIO. What I hear, which is always funny, is, "Oh, Doug, my state CIO, he or she, they're doing a great job, but I just wish they would speak English." And so that's a challenge. You've got to be able to translate the value proposition of the benefits, because states run on IT,
And they do.
Understand that, and I think they need to understand that better as the bottom line. Let me flick back here to, as I want to be able to at least cover, we're going to combine some of these questions, Alan, that we got during a registration, but one of these is around a topic we hear a lot about, and I guess it's a state local challenge about, are you seeing an increase in efforts by statewide organizations to increase of whole of state service offerings, especially around cyber? And do you expect further adoption of standard cybersecurity programs, specifically state ramp or similar, that are designed to serve across state and local jurisdictions? Well, certainly on the service offerings, there's no doubt that we're seeing a growth in those areas, driven by a number of things, but this is not new. The ability of states to deliver and open up their master state price contracts have been around for years. We now have just turned it into more of a program and policy side with things like whole of state, where you're bringing in local governments, you're bringing in, again, utilities, healthcare institutions, the educational environment. So you're bringing those in, and even your corporate entities within the state. So it's much more of we're going to address cyber disruption from that whole of state model, whole of state resilient, which is clearly a good thing, something NASCIO has advocated for. We've talked about whole of state, and there's some really good examples of whole of state where there's a real good interaction with the local government. So states like Arizona have a pretty mature whole of state program, and Michigan's been doing it for years. So New Jersey, there's other states where they're not only involved in governance, but they're also delivering those services. That's going to clearly expand during the with the grant program. States are making those decisions that it might be more efficient and a better use of those dollars to deliver cybersecurity training from a whole of state perspective to their local colleagues, and not give out discrete grants to do things like cyber training. So that's part of that. And then I think the second part on state ramp, just a disclaimer, I've been involved in state ramp since its inception, and involved in many committees. Alan and I both are actually on the state ramp steering committee. That I see the value proposition there, because you have a kind of a collaborative group of state and local and private companies that can come up with, again, a good housekeeping seal for those third-party providers, that's being assessed with a rigid and common framework. If you don't have that, and clearly what would have happened, which has happened in a lot of other domains, is that the states would all be doing that individually. And the outcome of that, if you fast forward 5 or 10 years, would have been 50 different versions of the truth, with each state imprinting their own activity. That is not beneficial to the marketplace. It's certainly not beneficial to the cloud service providers, because then they have to be able to adapt to each state. So I think having a national state ramp model, which is very obviously built, modeled off of the FedRAMP side, is going to be valuable to both constituencies, both the states and the vendor community, and it allows a lot of smaller players in that space to be able to compete in state government. So that's my commercial message with my disclaimer. Alan.
Well, I have two ways to answer that. I mean, one, when it comes to local government, I think local governments have a history of working together in ways that aren't always publicly addressed. Bigger counties take on cities. GIS is a great example where somebody that has more of the expertise can take on the layering, but making it available to everybody. There's a lot of sharing of services, but and that continues mostly by necessity, which is good. The state issue is tricky. Every survey for the last 4 years shows that a majority of local government CIOs are completely in the dark about what's going on with the state, and the state CIO in particular. They don't have a relationship. They're not sure what's available. So we see reports sometimes saying, oh, we have all these services available, and then we find a CIO has no idea. So there's a real gap. Now, I'm not faulting the state CIO at all in this. And the ones I've talked to, I said, it's me and it's everybody. How do I reach them? What is the best mechanism? And I think the missing piece in the whole of government approach is we need to figure out better ways to tie in the local governments structurally in an ongoing, not ad hoc governance pattern. I've been advocating the last couple of years that I think every state left to its own should divide their state into regions and then take the dominant player in any given region, whether it be a city or a county or some entity, to be the main coordinator, so that there's a reasonable way to manage the requests, pool together information, possibly have somebody reporting to the state CIO or another cabinet level position that does nothing but coordinate a high level with all these regions, so that we have this ongoing relationship. Absent that, we're really struggling to make these connections on a permanent basis. So it is a goal. I think it's worthy. I think it makes sense to put these things to scale. Now, some people say that they can get better deals from vendors outside of some of the shared programs for purchasing. And the last piece I want to mention is we've not talked about the purchasing officer. I think we've got to figure out better ways to educate the purchasing officers and let them work more closely, at least with local government CIOs. And sometimes there's this big gap. And when I talk to the purchasing professional, they always say, I have no idea what they're doing. So when they look at something, they're looking at it from a very different perspective. There needs to be greater trust, and trust begins with having ongoing relationships. So there's some relationship building here, and there's some governance building I think that needs to occur, but the desire is there.
Agree. And what we have found, and now Alan is correct, when we look at our own data, the challenges, there's a kind of a two-part answer to that. One is traditionally, historically, states and the state CIO organization, although they make these offers, I call them, the offers of assistance, and they have these capabilities and they have these master contracts, they have no dollars to market these services. So they're offering them, but they're not actually out doing educational promotion. Some states do. Texas does an excellent job in that vein. There's a good example of a state that does that. But for the most part, whether it's boxes and wires or whether it's services, the states don't have the real financial capacity and resources to go out and make these services known. So it's up to the local governments to find them on their own, and that's not a very effective collaboration model. But I see those opportunities growing in the future if we get more of these programs. Alan's right, the procurement officials got to be part of that. The other part for the states side is the fact that it creates having worked in the state where we created these programs, they can take some time to develop and build the trust between the two partners. The local governments need to trust their state to deliver on the promise. That has been a real challenge in the states because of the churn of the state CIO leadership. Again, as I mentioned, 21 already this year. The current median tenure of a state CIO is 24 months. 24 months. We have a very, very small number of CIOs that have over 5 years of tenure. And so that creates a challenge to that. The local government partners is they don't know who's on first. And the new CIO coming in, local government relationships is not part of their, the strategic top list of priorities. So something we definitely have to work on. Question I'm going to jump back here, Alan, through our list. I'm trying to give us some different aspects. Here's a question that is different than all the others, which is a state question, but these positions started in local governments. What is the status of states hiring chief data officers, the CDO? In general, what is their role, and where have the CDOs been effective? About half the states today have a chief data officer. The majority of them report to the CIO organization, but there's others that have independent agencies or report through the budget office or through the office of Department of Administration, for example. Their basic role is around data governance and around effective data management at the enterprise level, meaning executive branch of state government. They're involved in creating the data architecture, trying to normalize the data elements out there, look at rationalizing what's going on in the data space. But a lot of that has to do with education and awareness around, again, building standards for the handling of data and looking for those opportunities to exploit data for significant public sector problems, but doing that where you can utilize the resources from across the various agencies. So there's lots of good examples. I think states have been effective in some cases, not in all, but in some in doing that. I would point to Indiana, MPH, Indiana Management Performance Hub. NASCIO has recognized them in the past for some of their really remarkable achievements in managing data, and also in being a shared service delivery for data analytics. So that's obviously the key there is, can you use those data analytics tools to deliver and address these societal and public sector problems at the state level? That's what Indiana does. So they have a whole portfolio of work that they do as a shared service, working with their collaborative agencies. In our recent report, recent data, and we'll be reporting this certainly in a couple of months, not surprisingly, one of the major challenges that NASCIO spoke to this at our mid-year conference in May, is that states have not really moved to educating the rank and file employees and what we call kind of a data literacy program. And we have found that 90%, almost 90% of the states do not have that. I think there were 7 or 8 states today that actually have a formal data literacy program, Indiana being one of them, to actually be able to educate, again, and reskill their employees around effectively using data for evidence-based decision-making and insights. And so that's a challenge. But Alan, I know the local governments were actually the first to bring some chief data officers on, and they were focused, as you mentioned previously, on open data.
They were. I mean, starting in Chicago and then moving to Boston, New York. I mean, this is nothing new. They may not have had the title, but they certainly had the function that continues today. And parallel to that, I know we're running out of time, is the fact that many chief performance officers got into changes of titles. Performance was looking as punitive, and then it became chief, not performance, but chief improvement officer, using data to make things better. And now many of those same people are now chief data officers. So I would say someone is watching that, and someone is responsible for that at almost in every local government, one way or the other. Some have the title and some don't. But it's an important issue, and most still report to the CIO.
Thank you, Alan. And right at the top of the hour, we have exhausted our time today. We've flown through some of these questions, and certainly apologize that we weren't able to get to all the questions in the chat, and try to address a number of those, and also combined some of the questions we got in the pre-registration function. So personally, I want to thank all of you that were able to attend this afternoon, and hope you've got some insights as to what we're seeing in the state and local side. So on behalf of NASCIO, I thank you for your kind attention and your continued support of our organizations. Alan, closing comments.
Same thing. It's a privilege being with you again. I think we have a winning strategy. We've had hundreds on the call. I appreciate that. I know many will be on the rebroadcast. So if you need a copy of the slide decks, let us know. But it's a pleasure, and just keep your questions coming. We're there for you.
Thank you. And you all have a good rest of the day and a good week. Thank you. Bye.